Now, today has seen the annual pre-Christmas tradition in Moscow, an hours-long marathon news conference by Vladimir Putin, at which he takes questions from journalists, TV viewers and invited guests. Well, during today's event, President Putin said he'd not yet met Syria's ousted President Assad, but does plan to do that. He also denied Assad's defeat was a defeat for Russia. He also said he's prepared for talks and compromises over the future of Ukraine, but that the Ukrainian authorities should also be prepared to compromise. Well, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg was at that news conference and asked Vladimir Putin if he thinks he's been successful as Russia's leader.
Exactly 25 years ago, Boris Yeltsin resigned office, and he handed over the power to you, and he told you, stay on guard. 25 years later, would you say you have succeeded in it? Because from our part, we see significant losses during the so-called special military operation that you have declared. We see Ukraine soldiers in the Kursk region. You criticize the NATO expansion and enlargement, but there is now a greater NATO presence at the Russian borderline. I mean Sweden and Finland. We have demographic and economic problems. What do you think? Have you succeeded? Yes, I believe I have. I believe we have moved away from the brink of an abyss, because what happened to Russia before that and after that was leading us to a complete and total loss of our sovereignty. And without sovereignty, Russia cannot exist as an independent state.
Well, just a small part of that news conference. Let's talk to the Washington Post journalist and author of Putin's People, Catherine Belton. And Catherine, welcome here to the programme. I know you listened to large parts of that marathon news conference. What were your major takeaways?
I think actually the biggest takeaway for me was the beginning, when he was facing a lot of questions about the economy. It's clear citizens and all the people are worried about rising prices. Inflation has been soaring. It's now at 9%, essentially as a result of sanctions and Putin's wartime spending spree on the military. And this is involving basic foodstuffs such as potatoes, which are now up nearly 80% on the year. And Putin, though he's trying to project this image as he was to your correspondent just now, of everything being fine and everything being stable, he did admit that inflation is now alarming and he's facing really growing pressures on the economy.
And of course, interest rates, I think, are at 21%. How big a problem is this likely to be into 2025, the economy?
I think it's the biggest risk that he's facing. Yes, he is facing growing losses now on the battlefield. I think you had General Kellogg, President-elect Trump's nominated special envoy for Ukraine, saying that Russia is currently facing losses of 1.2 thousand men per day on the battlefield. But the economy is really the biggest risk for him, because you've even seen his closest allies, members of his inner circle, such as Igor Sechin and Sergei Chemezov, his best friends from St. Petersburg, essentially claim that the interest rates are so sky high that he could be facing bankruptcies in the economy next year. Russia has very high corporate debt levels, and at some point this isn't going to be sustainable for him. Right now he thinks he's winning, and he is, because Ukraine is undermanned, undersupplied with weapons, and it just hasn't been given adequate amounts of weapons, and they think that Trump is going to cut aid. But at the if Western aid is sustained for another year, then Putin is going to face a much trickier position.
Well, you take me to exactly where I wanted to go, because you touched on it. The losses now are horrific in terms of the main battle lines. Also, Donald Trump may or may not throw him a lifeline by trying to force a settlement on Ukraine. But if he doesn't try to force that settlement and you have those losses, how sustainable is that for Putin?
Yeah, it's just going to get more and more difficult for him, because I mean, like I mentioned, the central bank has been battling with inflation. It's been trying to rein it in, and yet the prices keep rising because of sanctions are making it more and more expensive to import goods. And Putin has raised spending on the military to really very high levels. The amount of spending on the defense sector next year is going to be a record $126 billion. There's a labor force shortage because of the war and the round-the-clock military output. And it's just, and the fact that interest rates are now at 21%, and the central bank tomorrow is due to convene a meeting where they're about to go to 23%, and yet inflation is still soaring, just shows that their efforts to rein in inflation are just not working. And you also saw Putin facing more and more questions about the level of losses as well on the battlefield, which just show growing anxiety. And you have this sniping now among the elite. You have infighting breaking out, which also adds to the sense of insecurity. I think Putin's probably fine to keep going for another
Yes.
year, but if somehow the West can sustain the level of aid to Ukraine, then this time next year he's going to be facing a much more precarious position.
A broader final thought then, because you touched on the economy, you touched on Ukraine. Russia is also now being forced to leave their bases in Syria. As we get to the end of 2024, is he in a stronger or weaker position than when he was at the start of this year?
That's a difficult question to answer because, yes, on the face of it, it looks like he's doing very well. He himself said we have economic growth of 4% this year. It's much higher than in Europe. And also, he's sort of riding high too from the election win of Donald Trump, who he hopes and believes, at least according to Trump's rhetoric so far, that the supply of weaponry to Ukraine is going to get cut. He's looking at the West, seeing the disarray in European capitals where we've seen a vote of no confidence in France and in Germany too. So he clearly believes he's winning right now on the battlefield, and he is, because, as we mentioned, Ukraine has been undersupplied. It doesn't have enough weaponry to battle Russia's advances. So at the moment, he thinks he's going to be able to ride it out, especially given the change in the political situation in the West. But if somehow Trump believes that Putin is not entering negotiations in good faith, and Trump may find some steel to actually increase weapons to Ukraine and combat the failings of the Biden regime and counter them. And if maybe Europe decides to send the $300 billion in reserves from the Russian central bank that it seized over Ukraine's invasion, then Putin's going to be facing a very different picture. So at the moment, yes, he's winning, but it could all flip by this time next year.
Catherine, fascinating analysis. Thank you so much.